At my son's wedding, he marched up to my table and shouted, "Get out, Mom! My new bride doesn't want you here." I did not scream or cry. I simply walked away. The next morning he called, demanding the keys to Freedom Hill Ranch. I took a deep breath and gave him 4 words he would never forget. The heavy bass of the rhythm and blues music vibrated straight through the polished floorboards and into the soles of my shoes. I sat quietly at table 14. It was the absolute worst seat in the grand ballroom of the exclusive Atlanta Country Club. I was tucked away in a dark back corner directly next to the swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. Waiters rushed past my chair carrying trays of filet mignon and roasted asparagus, bumping my shoulder every few minutes. I did not complain. I just watched. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. My hands tell the real story of my life. They are calloused and scarred from 40 years of gripping leather reins, fixing wire fences, and managing the soil at Freedom Hill Ranch. That is the 500-acre equestrian estate. My late husband Jeremiah and I built from absolutely nothing. We bred quarter horses. We ran summer programs for black youth from the inner city to come out to the country, learn discipline, and find peace. We built a legacy of generational wealth in the Georgia dirt. This land was not just property to us, it was a hard-won victory. Jeremiah's grandfather had purchased the very first 50 acres of this land with money he saved from decades of working as a sharecropper. Every single generation of our family had bled and sweat to keep it out of the hands of greedy banks and opportunistic politicians. We fought too hard to build this sanctuary to let it be paved over today. But tonight that dirt felt very far away. Tonight was all about crystal chandeliers, imported French champagne, and a $120,000 price tag. I paid for every single dime of it. I wrote the massive checks to save my son Kendrick from total public humiliation. Kendrick is 34 years old. 6 months ago, he came to my porch with tears in his eyes. His high-end consulting firm in the city was quietly going bankrupt. He had maxed out his credit lines trying to keep up with the Atlanta elite. More importantly, he was terrified of losing Valerie. Valerie was his new bride. She was currently twirling on the center dance floor, wearing a custom designer gown covered in pearls. Valerie is the kind of woman who measures a person by the brand of their shoes and the zip code of their address. She never liked me. She hated the smell of the ranch. She hated that I wore denim instead of designer labels. She saw Freedom Hill not as a proud family legacy, but as a giant piece of undeveloped commercial land just waiting to be cashed out. When she demanded a lavish, no-expenses-spared wedding, Kendrick panicked. I stepped in and quietly funded the entire event to protect his pride and keep his business failure a secret from her family. I thought I was doing what a mother should do. I thought I was helping him transition into a new chapter of life. I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. As I sat there sipping my ice water, I watched Valerie lean into Kendrick on the dance floor. The spotlight caught her perfect smile. She whispered something directly into his ear. Then she turned her head and glared straight across the room, locking eyes with me in my dark little corner. Her smile vanished. She looked at me with pure, undisguised disgust. She whispered to Kendrick again and gave him a sharp push on the chest. Kendrick stopped dancing immediately. His own smile dropped. He nodded to her like a subordinate taking an order from a boss. He turned his back on his new wife and began marching straight toward my table. He moved fast, dodging guests and weaving through the tables. He did not look happy to see the woman who had just paid for his open bar. He looked furious. He stopped right in front of my chair, completely blocking my view of the room. He did not sit down. He did not lean in. He stood over me, looking down his nose. "Mom," Kendrick said. His voice was clipped cold and sharp enough to cut through the loud music. "You need to leave." I looked up at my son. The boy I had carried, the boy Jeremiah had taught to ride horses, the boy we had sacrificed our youth to provide for. I carefully picked up my cloth napkin and wiped the corners of my mouth. I did not raise my voice. After 40 years of managing a massive ranch, you learn very quickly that raising your voice only spooks the horses. True power is perfectly quiet. "Excuse me," I asked calmly. "Get out, Mom. Valerie does not want you here," he said, his jaw clenching with irritation. "You are completely ruining her vibe. Your whole energy is just stressing her out on her special day. You are sitting here looking miserable and making her uncomfortable. The car is already waiting outside by the valet stand. Give them your name and go back to the ranch." I stared at him. He was throwing me out of a party I had paid for. He was evicting me from a celebration I had single-handedly financed to save his reputation. The sheer audacity of his entitlement took my breath away, but I refused to give him the satisfaction of a scene. I refused to let Valerie watch me cry. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the skirt of my navy blue dress. I picked up my clutch purse from the table. I looked my son dead in the eye, letting him see exactly who he was dealing with. "Enjoy your night, Kendrick," I said, my voice steady and cold as ice. "It is the last one you will ever have on my dime." He rolled his eyes, clearly dismissing my words as the empty threat of a hurt old woman. "Just go, Mom," he muttered, turning his back on me to head back to the dance floor. I did not look back. I pushed open the heavy swinging metal doors of the catering kitchen. The kitchen staff stopped washing dishes and stared at me as I walked past the prep stations. I kept my head held high, my posture straight, projecting the dignity of a woman who owned 500 acres of premium real estate. I walked out the back service exit into the cool night air. The music faded into a dull thump behind the thick brick walls of the country club. I walked right past the valet stand. I ignored the black car waiting with its hazard lights blinking. I had no intention of getting into his vehicle. At the far end of the parking lot, a black Jeep Cherokee waited beneath the oak trees. I climbed into the passenger seat, and the heavy doors closed with a solid sound, shutting out the faint rhythm of the wedding reception still echoing across the country club grounds. I leaned back against the leather headrest and let out a long, slow breath. I did not shed a single tear. Tears are a luxury for women who have the time to be victims, and I had a massive war to win. I looked over at the young man sitting in the driver's seat. Trey was 19 years old, a sophomore at Morehouse College, and the only genuinely good thing my son Kendrick had ever managed to produce in his entire life. Trey was Kendrick's son from his first marriage, a marriage to a wonderful woman who passed away far too young. Valerie, the arrogant new bride currently wearing a fortune in silk and diamonds on the dance floor, had always deeply resented Trey's existence. She treated him like an inconvenient ghost from a past she desperately wanted erased. But Trey was no ghost. He was brilliantly alive. He was studying cybersecurity, and he had absolutely inherited his grandfather Jeremiah's razor-sharp mind and unyielding sense of loyalty. Trey kept the engine idling in the shadows of the massive oak trees. He did not put the car into drive. Instead, he reached into the back seat and pulled a heavy silver laptop onto his lap. The blue light from the screen illuminated his face in the dark cabin. His jaw was clenched tight. I could see the profound hurt in his dark brown eyes, the specific kind of pain that only comes from watching your own father act like an absolute fool. "I cannot believe he actually did it," Trey said, his voice thick with a heavy mixture of burning anger and utter disbelief. "He really just stood there and threw you out of the wedding you paid for." "He thinks he threw me out," I corrected him calmly, smoothing the fabric of my navy blue dress. There is a massive difference between being pushed out of a room and choosing to walk away before the ceiling collapses. "Did you get the final confirmation?" Trey nodded, his fingers flying rapidly across the glowing keyboard. Because he was studying cybersecurity and because he expertly managed the digital infrastructure for our youth writing programs at Freedom Hill Ranch. Trey had full legal administrative access to all of our business servers. That included the ranch's primary email routing system, which Kendrick foolishly still used for his personal communications because he liked the prestigious-sounding domain name. "I have it right here, Big Mama," Trey said. He turned the screen toward me. "Dad just sent this email from his phone 10 minutes ago. He sent it right from the center dance floor, probably right after he told you to leave the reception. It is addressed to the lead acquisitions director at the commercial development firm." I looked at the glowing screen in the dark cab of the Jeep. My stomach turned to absolute ice as I read the terrible words my son had typed on his most special day. The message was short, incredibly arrogant, and completely devastating. "The old lady is finally out of the picture," the email read. "The deed is secured, the ink is dry. See you at the ranch tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock for the final walkthrough. Bring the deposit check." A cold fire ignited deep in my chest. Freedom Hill was not just a piece of real estate. It was a 500-acre sanctuary. It was the beautiful legacy my late husband Jeremiah and I had built from the dirt up. We bought that land when no bank would give a commercial loan to a young black couple. We bred champion quarter horses. We ran programs for inner-city youth, giving kids who had only ever seen concrete a chance to touch nature, learn discipline, and find a sense of absolute peace. When Jeremiah died of a severe stroke 5 years ago, he left the ranch to me, but he placed it in an unbreakable trust meant to pass down to Kendrick and Trey. He wanted the legacy to survive us. But Kendrick hated the dirt. He hated the early mornings, the smell of the stables, and the hard, unrelenting work of maintaining an empirical estate. He moved to Atlanta, chased high society status, and eventually met Valerie. Valerie was a woman who looked at 500 acres of gorgeous rolling Georgia pastures and saw nothing but a $4 million piece of undeveloped commercial land. She did not care about the youth programs. She did not care about the blood and sweat it took to keep that land in our family. She just wanted the massive financial payout to fund her luxury lifestyle, and she had convinced my only son to steal his own inheritance to give it to her. "He really thinks he outsmarted me," I said softly. I reached up and touched the heavy silver cross necklace resting against my collarbone. Jeremiah had given me this cross on our 20th wedding anniversary as a symbol of our enduring strength. "Big Mama, I do not understand," Trey said. Panic was starting to edge into his young voice. He closed the laptop slightly, looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "How did he get the deed you would never sign over Freedom Hill? You told me the trust was totally locked. Did he forge your signature? If he forged it, we can call the police right now." "He did not forge my signature, Trey," I said quietly, looking out the window at the glowing lights of the country club. "He tricked me into signing it, or at least he completely believes he successfully tricked me." Trey shook his head, thoroughly confused. "How?" "Valerie convinced him that I was just a tired old widow who was going legally blind and losing my mental sharpness," I explained, turning back to face my anxious grandson. "She told him that I was too naive to understand modern business contracts. So 2 months ago, when Kendrick brought me a massive stack of paperwork to sign for the wedding venue liability, they buried a quitclaim deed right in the middle of it." Trey gasped loudly, his hands dropping from the steering wheel. "A quitclaim deed for the ranch." "Exactly." I nodded, keeping my composure perfectly intact. "It was buried maliciously on page 42 of a 50-page catering and venue packet. It was a legal document signing over my 100% controlling equity of Freedom Hill Ranch directly to Kendrick. They thought I would just blindly sign the bottom line because I trusted my son." I let out a dry, humorless laugh that echoed sharply in the quiet car. They thought I was an absolute fool. They forgot that I was the woman who had personally managed Freedom Hill's complicated payroll for 4 decades. I was the woman who ruthlessly negotiated our corporate grazing contracts. I was the proud woman who had successfully fought off predatory land developers and aggressive tax assessors for 30 long years. I have never signed a single document in my entire life without reading every single line of the fine print. When Kendrick had handed me that thick stack of papers in my kitchen 2 months ago, acting remarkably sweet and overly affectionate, my maternal instincts had immediately flared. I took the packet into my private study, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and read it word for word. When I reached page 42 and saw the quitclaim deed attempting to steal my life's work, my heart broke into a million irreparable pieces. My own flesh and blood was trying to rob me blind to impress a selfish gold digger. I did not confront him. I did not scream or cry or throw him out of my house. Anger is loud, but strategy is silent. Instead, I took those papers straight to my attorney, Mr. Sterling. Sterling had been my late husband's closest friend, and he is without question the fiercest legal shark in the entire state of Georgia. We sat in his downtown office for 3 hours, and we executed a highly complex legal maneuver called a decoy substitution. "So he does not have the deed?" Trey asked, a massive wave of relief visibly washing over his broad shoulders. "He has a piece of paper that he thinks is a deed," I said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across my face. "But he is about to find out that trying to outsmart the very woman who taught him how to walk is the absolute worst mistake he will ever make." I reached out and patted Trey's arm affectionately. I could feel the adrenaline pulsing powerfully through both of us. The deep heartbreak of the ruined wedding was entirely gone, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of a general preparing for battle. Kendrick wanted to play a ruthless game of corporate theft, and he was about to learn that I wrote the rulebook. "Put the Jeep in drive, Trey," I commanded smoothly, settling back into my comfortable seat. "Drive us home to the ranch. Your father and his terrible new bride are bringing corporate developers to our front door at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. We have a very elaborate trap to set, and we need to have all our pieces perfectly in place before the sun comes up. We cannot afford a single mistake. Our legacy depends on what happens in those crucial morning hours." Start the powerful engine, grandson. Tonight we successfully defend Freedom Hill. Tomorrow we will teach them the true meaning of generational wealth and unbreakable family power. The sun broke over the eastern ridge of Freedom Hill Ranch exactly as it had for the last 40 years. The thick Georgia mist was slowly burning off the lower pastures, rolling away to reveal the vibrant, dew-soaked green grass beneath. I sat in my oversized cedar rocking chair on the wrap-around porch of the main house. The air was already growing thick with the promise of midday heat, carrying the familiar scents of damp earth pine needles and sweet feed from the stables. It was a beautiful, completely ordinary Sunday morning. But the peace of the landscape was a sharp contrast to the absolute war that was about to unfold on my front steps. Trey was sitting on the top porch step, leaning his back against the white wooden railing. He had his heavy silver laptop balanced perfectly on his knees. A mug of black coffee rested near his boots. He had not slept a single wink. He spent the entire night running diagnostic checks on our security cameras, ensuring every single lens pointing toward the driveway, and the porch was recording in high-definition audio and video. He also pulled the metadata from Kendrick's intercepted email to the commercial land developers, printing out hard copies, just in case we needed physical proof of his treacherous intentions. Trey looked exhausted, but his dark eyes were sharp and entirely focused. He was acting as the protector of a legacy. His own father was trying to sell out from under us. I held a tall glass of iced sweet tea in my hands. The condensation gathered on the outside of the glass, pooling against my fingertips. I rocked back and forth slowly. The wooden boards creaked a familiar rhythmic tune. I was not nervous. I had spent the night making peace with the fact that the son I had raised was completely gone. The man who threw me out of his wedding reception was a stranger infected by greed and manipulated by a woman who saw my family's history as a quick cash grab. Valerie wanted my land to fund her luxury handbags and her high society brunches. Kendrick was willing to hand it to her on a silver platter, but they fundamentally misunderstood what kind of woman they were trying to rob. I glanced at the vintage gold watch on my left wrist. It belonged to my late husband, Jeremiah. The hands clicked perfectly to 8:15 in the morning. Exactly on schedule, the heavy silence of the porch was shattered by a sharp, vibrating ringtone. My cell phone was resting on the small wrought iron patio table next to my tea. The bright screen illuminated, displaying Kendrick's name in bold black letters. Trey immediately looked up from his laptop. His jaw tightened. He reached out and tapped a key on his computer, bringing up the live feed of the main entrance gates located 2 miles down the dirt road. We were entirely ready. I did not pick up the phone immediately. I let it ring. I let the sound echo across the porch. I let it ring a second time, forcing him to wait. I let it ring a third time, establishing the absolute pace and control of this interaction. A desperate man is always in a rush, but a powerful woman has all the time in the world. Finally, right before it could go to voicemail, I reached out and tapped the green speaker button. "Mom," Kendrick's voice barked through the speaker. He did not sound like a man who had just spent the night celebrating his brand-new marriage. He did not sound tired or hungover. He sounded frantic, heavily wired, and completely manic. He was breathing heavily, his words tumbling out in a rapid, aggressive rush. "Good morning, Kendrick," I replied. My voice was smooth, pleasant, and as deeply soothing as the southern breeze. I gave him absolutely nothing to push against. "I am heading out to the property right now," he announced. He was not asking for permission. He was issuing a command. "I need you to go down to the main iron gates and make sure they are completely unlocked. Leave them propped wide open. I also need you to leave the master keys to the lower barn and the main grazing pastures in the lockbox by the side door." I took a very slow, deliberate sip of my sweet tea. I made absolutely sure he could hear the ice cubes clinking softly against the glass through the phone speaker. I wanted him to hear exactly how unbothered I was. "Master keys?" I asked innocently. "Whatever for, and why on earth are you coming out to the ranch on a Sunday morning, the very day after your wedding? That seems incredibly urgent for a groom who should be packing his bags for a romantic honeymoon." "Valerie and I are delaying the honeymoon," he answered quickly. His tone was defensive and highly agitated. "We are making some massive financial moves today to secure our future. This cannot wait. I have some structural engineers coming to look at the barn foundations and the soil grading. We have a very tight schedule to keep." Structural engineers. That was a pathetic lie. They were the commercial land developers Kendrick had contacted. Kendrick was bringing corporate vultures in expensive suits to walk my land, measure my pastures, and plan where they would pour their concrete over the soil my husband bled for. "So, just leave the keys in the box, Mom." Kendrick continued, his voice growing incredibly arrogant and dismissive. "And honestly, it is probably best if you are not even there when we arrive. Go into the city for the morning, go to church, go to a diner, just leave the property. You will just get in the way of the assessment, and Valerie does not want to deal with any drama today." He was commanding me to leave my own home. He was formally attempting to evict me from the very land I had broken my back to pay for treating me like a bothersome, unwanted tenant who was ruining his big corporate moment. I looked out over the massive expanse of green land. I looked at the stables where Jeremiah had spent thousands of hours teaching broken-at-risk children how to trust again. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated disrespect vibrating through the tiny phone speaker. I stopped rocking my chair. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees. I looked directly at the phone. "Kendrick," I said. My voice dropped all of its pleasant southern warmth. It fell into a completely lethal, icy whisper. It was a tone I reserved only for dealing with aggressive predators. "What?" He snapped back impatiently, completely oblivious to the danger he was stepping into. "You own absolutely nothing." I reached out and tapped the red button, ending the call instantly. I did not give him a single second to respond. I did not let him argue. I did not demand an explanation or yell or curse. I simply let the devastating finality of those 4 words hang heavily in the warm morning air. Trey let out a low, sharp whistle. A massive, brilliant grin broke across his tired face. He shook his head in pure disbelief. "Oh, he is going to completely lose his mind right now. I guarantee he is screaming at the dashboard of his car. He is probably speeding down the highway trying to figure out what you meant." "Let him scream," I said, leaning back into my rocking chair and picking up my sweet tea again. "Open the main electronic gates, Trey. Keep them locked in the wide-open position. Let them drive all the way up the dirt driveway. I want them to park right in front of this porch. I want to see Valerie's perfectly contoured face when she realizes her $4 million golden goose is nothing but a plucked chicken." Trey turned his attention back to his laptop screen. He typed rapidly for a few seconds. The heavy mechanical gears of the iron gates 2 miles away groaned into motion. "Gates are secured open, Big Mama." Trey confirmed, his eyes shining with anticipation. "The trap is set. They can walk right in." "Good," I replied, staring down the long, winding dirt road. "A thief must be allowed to proudly present his stolen goods before you can properly expose him. We will wait right here. Let them come." Exactly. 45 minutes after I hung up the phone, a massive cloud of pale dust kicked up at the far end of the main driveway. The roar of a high-performance engine shattered the morning peace. Kendrick's leased silver Mercedes G-Wagon came speeding through the open gates, taking the curves entirely too fast. It was followed closely by a sleek black Range Rover with heavily tinted windows. The vehicles tore up the driveway, throwing gravel into the grass. They slammed on their brakes, throwing the cars into park directly in front of the main porch. The dust washed over the front steps. Kendrick threw his driver's side door open and leaped out. His face was flushed crimson with absolute rage. He wore a crisp designer suit completely inappropriate for a working ranch. Valerie climbed out of the passenger side, looking severely out of place. She wore a tight white dress, oversized designer sunglasses, and she held a delicate silk scarf over her nose, acting as if the natural smell of the ranch was a toxic hazard. The doors of the black Range Rover opened simultaneously. 2 men in sharp, tailored business suits stepped out onto the gravel. They looked around, clearly assessing the property value. These were the commercial developers. "What is the meaning of this?" Kendrick yelled at the top of his lungs. He stomped heavily up the wooden steps of the porch, pointing an aggressive finger at me. "What did you just say to me on the phone?" I did not stand up. I remained seated in my rocking chair. I looked at him with absolute unwavering calm. "I told you the truth, Kendrick," I stated clearly. "You do not own the keys. You do not own the gate. You do not own a single blade of grass on Freedom Hill." Kendrick's rage sharpened into a smug smile. He reached inside his jacket, pulled out a folded legal document, and slapped it onto the small patio table beside my sweet tea. In front of Valerie and the 2 developers, he declared that the paper proved he now controlled Freedom Hill and that I was formally being told to vacate the property. Valerie folded her arms as if the matter were already settled. One of the developers stepped forward and warned that if I refused to leave their new commercial site, they would call the county sheriff and have me removed. I looked at the document without touching it. Kendrick mistook my silence for defeat. Then the screen door behind me opened. The heavy wooden screen door of the main house swung open with a sharp, familiar creak. The sound cut through the tense morning air like a starting pistol. My attorney, Mr. Sterling, stepped out onto the wrap-around porch. He was a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Sterling had been my late husband, Jeremiah's closest confidant. He was also the most ruthless, brilliant legal mind in the entire state of Georgia. He did not lose cases, and he certainly did not let arrogant young men steal from his best friend's widow. Sterling held a thick manila folder in his left hand. He walked to the edge of the wooden porch and looked down at my son. Kendrick froze entirely. The aggressive, entitled posture he had carried up the driveway suddenly vanished. He took a small step backward, his expensive leather shoes crunching against the gravel. Valerie lowered her oversized designer sunglasses, her forehead wrinkling in deep confusion. She did not know who this man was, but she could clearly sense the massive shift in power. "Mr. Washington," Sterling said, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the yard, "I highly suggest you read the document you just slapped on that patio table. Pick it up and read it out loud for everyone present." Kendrick scoffed loudly, trying desperately to maintain his bravado in front of the two commercial land developers standing behind him. "I know exactly what it says," he snapped, crossing his arms over his chest. "It is a quitclaim deed. My mother signed it 2 months ago. The property is mine. We are wasting time here." "You are wasting time," Sterling countered smoothly, resting his hands on the porch railing. "But you are not holding a quitclaim deed. Read the top of the page, Kendrick. Read the bold print." Kendrick snatched the folded piece of paper off the small iron table. He snapped it open with a sharp flick of his wrist. His eyes darted to the top of the page. I watched from my rocking chair as the blood completely drained from his face. His skin turned a sickly pale gray. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. His hands, which had been so steady and confident just moments before, began to shake violently. The thick paper trembled in his grip. "What is the matter, baby?" Valerie asked, stepping up right behind him and placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. "Just show them the deed. Tell this old man to get out of our way so we can close this $4 million deal." "It is not a deed," Kendrick whispered. His voice was so hollow and weak that I could barely hear it over the gentle morning breeze. "It is not a deed." "Allow me to explain," Sterling said, opening his own manila folder and extracting a pristine copy of the exact same document. "When you attempted to slip a fraudulent property transfer into your mother's wedding venue contracts last month, she noticed it immediately. She brought the entire 50-page packet to my downtown office. Instead of confronting you and giving you a chance to formulate a new deceptive plan, she instructed my legal team to draft a very specific document. It is called a Declaration of Trust Revocation and Equity Waiver." "Bah!" Sterling pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, staring down at my son with absolute professional disgust. "Since your wedding contracts were bundled together in a massive binder, the signature page you had your mother sign was strictly and legally binding only for the catering service. However, the page you signed, the page you thought was a countersignature to finalize the property deed, was actually a formal waiver." Valerie stepped around Kendrick, snatching the paper from his shaking hands. She stared at the legal jargon, her eyes darting back and forth in total panic. "This does not make any sense," she shrieked, her high-pitched voice grating against my ears. "What does an equity waiver mean?" "It means exactly what it says," Sterling replied without missing a beat. "By blindly signing that specific document, Kendrick, you legally and permanently renounced all of your rights, all of your claims, and your entire future inheritance regarding Freedom Hill Ranch. You formally surrendered your 50% trust fund equity. And according to the binding terms of the waiver you authorized, you traded your entire birthright in exchange for a one-time cash payout." Kendrick dropped to his knees as if the gravity in the yard had suddenly doubled. The gravel crunched loudly beneath him. He looked up at Sterling, his face contorted into a mask of pure desperation and rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his tight collar. "What payout?" Kendrick screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with panic. I never got a single dollar from you. I never received a payout. You stole my land. You tricked me. Where is my cash payout? I finally stood up from my rocking chair. I smoothed the front of my white button-down shirt. I walked slowly to the edge of the porch, looking down at the pathetic, greedy man who had thrown me out of his wedding reception just 12 hours earlier. The air was thick and heavy. The two commercial developers standing near the Range Rover were completely silent, watching the entire scene unfold with growing horror. "Yes, Kendrick, you did receive your payout," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and loud enough for every single person in the driveway to hear. "You got a $120,000 wedding." Kendrick stared up at me, his eyes wide and uncomprehending. "The custom catering menu, featuring imported steak and lobster." I continued listing the items deliberately. The massive floral arrangements shipped in from overseas, the 12-piece live band, the premium open bar, the deposit on this ridiculous luxury vehicle you are currently driving. I paid for every single dime of it. I kept all the receipts. My accountants tallied the exact total of your wedding expenses, and it perfectly matched the current liquid value of your 50% share in the ranch trust. That was your payout. Valerie gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. She looked at Kendrick like he was a diseased animal. "You spent my entire $4 million payout on a party," she demanded, her voice shrill and trembling. "He did not spend $4 million, Valerie," I corrected her sharply. "That is what this land is worth to commercial developers. But to my family, this land is priceless. This land was bought with the blood, sweat, and endless sacrifice of black farmers who refused to be broken by the world. Your husband decided to treat his grandfather's sacred legacy like a casino chip. You sold your father's legacy, Kendrick. You threw away half a century of generational wealth for one single night of dancing with a woman who could not even stomach the sight of me sitting at table 14. The silence that fell over the ranch was absolutely deafening. The only sound was the wind blowing gently through the leaves of the ancient oak trees lining the driveway. Kendrick remained on his knees in the dirt, staring blankly at the legal documents scattered on the ground. He had tried to play a ruthless game of corporate theft, and he had completely destroyed his own life in the process. The taller of the two commercial developers suddenly cleared his throat. His face had turned a bright, furious shade of red. He marched forward, his polished shoes kicking up the gravel. He stopped just a few feet away from where Kendrick was kneeling. "Mr. Washington," the developer said, his professional demeanor entirely gone, replaced by pure, unfiltered corporate rage. "Are you telling us right now that you do not hold the deed to this property? You sat in our boardroom yesterday afternoon and signed a formal letter of intent with our firm claiming you had sole undisputed ownership of this land." "I did not know," Kendrick stammered, raising his hands in a weak defensive gesture. "I swear to you, I thought I had the deed. My mother tricked me. We can fix this. Just give me some time to talk to my lawyers." "That is wire fraud," the developer snapped, cutting him off completely. "You took a $50,000 good faith deposit from our firm yesterday morning based on fraudulent claims of ownership. You signed legal contracts promising us land that you do not even own. My legal team will be contacting the district attorney before noon today. You do not just owe us our deposit back, Mr. Washington. You are going to face federal charges. Let us go." The taller commercial developer did not wait for my son to offer another pathetic excuse. He turned on his heel and marched directly back to the sleek black Range Rover parked in my driveway. His partner followed close behind him, shaking his head in absolute disgust. Kendrick lunged forward, grabbing the heavy door handle of their vehicle before they could close it. He was practically hyperventilating, begging them to give him 24 hours to clear up what he was desperately calling a massive legal misunderstanding. He promised them he could fix it. He promised them he would get the land. The taller developer simply shoved Kendrick's hand off the doorframe. He looked at my son with the kind of cold contempt usually reserved for common street criminals. He told Kendrick to expect a call from federal investigators before noon and slammed the heavy door shut. The engine roared to life. The luxury vehicle reversed, sharply spun its thick tires in the loose gravel, and tore down the long dirt driveway. They drove away so fast that a massive cloud of pale Georgia dust billowed up into the warm morning air, completely coating Kendrick's expensive designer suit in a thick layer of grime. Kendrick stood frozen in the driveway for a long moment, watching the bright red taillights disappear through the main iron gates of Freedom Hill Ranch. The profound silence that settled over the property was heavy and completely suffocating. Even the horses in the lower pasture had gone perfectly still, as if they knew a storm had just broken. Slowly, Kendrick turned around to face his new bride. Valerie was standing a few feet away, her posture rigidly straight. Her oversized designer sunglasses hid her eyes, but her mouth was pressed into a thin, furious line. She looked absolutely terrifying in her pristine white dress, standing amidst the dirt and chaos. Kendrick took a hesitant step toward her. He raised his hands in a pleading gesture, his voice shaking with raw, unfiltered panic. He called her baby. He begged her to just listen to him for one single minute. He frantically promised her that he could easily hire a new team of aggressive corporate lawyers, sue Mr. Sterling for gross legal malpractice, and fight this entire situation in a federal courtroom. He promised her over and over again that they would still get their $4 million payout. Valerie did not move a single inch. She stared at him with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the sweet, melodic tone she had used to charm him for the past 2 years. It was harsh, shrill, and dripping with absolute venom. She demanded to know exactly what money he planned to use to hire these imaginary corporate lawyers. She took a step forward and began verbally tearing his entire life apart, piece by piece, in front of everyone on the porch. She screamed that his high-end consulting business was completely bankrupt and that he had not landed a single paying client in over 8 months. She yelled that every one of his premium credit cards was maxed out to the limit. She reminded him that he could not even afford the monthly lease payments on the Mercedes SUV they drove to the ranch this morning. Valerie laid all his humiliating financial secrets bare in the bright sunlight. She shrieked that the only reason she had stayed through the stress of his failing business was because he had sworn on his life that she would be walking away with $4 million today. She told him he was a pathetic loser who had ruined her life. Kendrick looked like he had been physically struck by a heavy blow. The color drained from his face all over again. He reached out desperately, trying to grab her hands to calm her down. He begged her to lower her voice so the neighbors would not hear. He reminded her that they had just stood at a beautiful altar and pledged their lives to each other less than 24 hours ago in front of 200 wealthy guests. Valerie slapped his hands away with violent force. She screamed at him not to ever touch her again. Then, with a look of absolute disgust on her perfectly contoured face, she grabbed her left hand. She gripped the massive diamond engagement ring sitting on her finger. That was the very same diamond ring I had secretly co-signed the massive bank loan for because Kendrick's credit score was too destroyed to secure it himself. Valerie ripped the heavy ring off her finger. She did not politely hand it back to him. She wound her arm back and threw it directly at his chest with all her might. The expensive diamond bounced off his ruined jacket and landed somewhere deep in the thick Georgia dirt. Valerie did not even wait to see where the precious ring fell. She spun around on her high heels and marched aggressively toward the silver Mercedes G-Wagon. Kendrick finally snapped out of his total state of shock and ran after her. He chased his angry new bride around the front of the vehicle, calling her name, begging her not to overreact and leave him behind. Valerie reached the driver's side door, yanked it open forcefully, and climbed up into the luxurious leather seat. Kendrick lunged for the passenger side door handle, yanking on it with all his remaining strength. It was locked tightly. Valerie had hit the central locking button the second she got inside the car. Kendrick slammed his open palms against the dark-tinted glass, screaming her name loudly, pleading with her to just roll down the window and talk to him. Valerie ignored his desperate pleas completely. She started the powerful engine, the sound roaring across the quiet ranch. She threw the heavy vehicle into reverse, forcing Kendrick to jump backward to avoid being crushed by the massive tires. She spun the steering wheel sharply, shifting the car into drive. She slammed her foot down hard on the gas pedal and tore out of the ranch. She left her husband standing entirely alone in a choking cloud of thick dust. The roaring sound of the Mercedes engine quickly faded away down the highway, leaving nothing but the gentle rustle of the wind blowing through the ancient oak trees. The thick dust slowly settled back onto the gravel driveway. Kendrick stood perfectly still for a very long time, staring blindly down the empty dirt road. His breathing was heavy and ragged, echoing in the quiet space. He slowly turned around to face the main house. His expensive suit was covered in dirt, his tie was loosened, and his immense pride was completely shattered. The arrogant man who had proudly marched up to my table and maliciously thrown me out of his luxury wedding reception was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, pathetic boy who had just lost absolutely everything he claimed to value. His business was dead, his bride was gone, his money was a total illusion, and his reputation with the corporate developers was completely ruined. He had gambled his entire generational legacy on a beautiful lie, and the house had finally won. He had nothing left to hide behind. His legs seemed to finally give out beneath him. Kendrick fell heavily to his knees in the dirt, the sharp gravel biting deeply into his ruined trousers. He buried his face in his hands and his broad shoulders began to heave. He was crying. Deep, heavy sobs tore through his chest, echoing loudly in the quiet morning air. He looked up at the porch where I was standing. His eyes were red and streaming with hot tears. He looked directly at me. He raised one trembling hand in the air, his voice breaking violently as he called out. He begged me to help him fix this massive mess. He begged me to forgive him for his terrible disrespect. He cried out that he had nowhere else to go, that his entire life was completely over, and that he desperately needed his mother to save him one last time. I stood on the edge of the wooden porch, looking down at the son I had sacrificed my entire life to raise. My face was completely blank. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I simply stared at him in complete, absolute silence. Kendrick wiped his face with the back of his dirty sleeve. He looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. He swallowed hard and tried again. He told me he was sorry. He said he made a terrible mistake. He begged to come inside so we could talk like a family. He said we needed to fix the mess with the commercial developers before federal investigators ruined his life. He actually had the absolute nerve to invoke his father. He cried out that Jeremiah would never want to see his only son destroyed like this. He said his father would have forgiven him because family always takes care of family no matter what happens. I gripped the wooden railing of the porch. My knuckles turned white under the intense pressure. Hearing him use Jeremiah to justify his greed made my blood boil. I did not yell. I spoke with a quiet, terrifying clarity. I reminded him exactly who his father was. I told him that Jeremiah bled for this specific soil. Jeremiah broke his back in the blistering Georgia heat to pay off the heavy banknotes on this land, so our family would never have to bow down to anyone. Jeremiah built a powerful empire out of pure dirt and determination, and Kendrick had actively tried to pave over that sacred legacy with commercial concrete, just to buy the temporary affection of a woman who completely despised us. Valerie hated the smell of the very dirt that paid for her expensive silk dresses. I told my son that invoking his father was the absolute most insulting thing he could possibly do right now. His father built a safe sanctuary for our community. Kendrick tried to build a soulless strip mall. Kendrick dropped his head, staring blankly at the gravel. He wrapped his arms around his own chest like he was freezing in the warm morning sun. He asked what he should do now. He said his phone battery was dying. He said his wallet and all his identification were inside Valerie's designer purse, which was currently speeding down the highway toward Atlanta. He did not even have the cash to call a taxi. He begged to come inside the main house for a few minutes. He wanted to use the landline. He wanted a cold glass of water. He desperately wanted a place to hide from the massive, crushing consequences of his own disastrous choices. I looked down at him without a single ounce of sympathy. I told him that the main house was permanently closed to him. The heavy wooden doors were locked. The kitchen was closed. The sanctuary he tried to sell to corporate vultures was no longer his home. I reminded him that just a few hours ago, he stood on this exact porch and formally tried to evict me. He had boldly told me to leave my own property so I would not get in the way of his massive corporate payout. I was simply returning the favor. I told him he was trespassing on private property and he needed to vacate the premises immediately. I turned my head and looked at Trey. My 19-year-old grandson was standing near the front door. He had remained entirely silent during the intense confrontation, but his steady presence was a heavy anchor of support. I gave him a single, sharp nod. I ordered Trey to escort his father off the property. I told him that if Kendrick refused to leave or tried to force his way into the house, he should call the county sheriff right away and have him arrested for criminal trespassing. Trey did not hesitate for a second. He walked down the wooden steps of the porch. His heavy boots thumped solidly against the wood. He pulled his smartphone out of his pocket and held it up directly in front of his face. The red recording light blinked steadily. He was recording the entire eviction process for our legal protection. Trey knew that desperate men often change their stories when the police get involved, and we needed absolute digital proof that Kendrick left without a physical altercation. Trey stopped a few feet from where his father knelt in the dirt. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly disappointed, which is always a much heavier burden to bear. He told his father to get up. He pointed his finger down the long, winding dirt driveway. He reminded Kendrick that the walk to the main highway was exactly 2 miles long. The morning sun was getting hot. There was absolutely no shade on the long access road. He told his father he better start walking right now before the sheriff was called to give him a ride in the back of a police squad car. Kendrick slowly pushed himself up from the sharp gravel. His expensive suit was ruined. His knees were deeply stained with dark dirt, and his tailored jacket was coated in pale dust. He looked at me one last time, hoping to see a tiny crack in my armor. He hoped to see the soft, forgiving mother he had successfully manipulated for years. He saw absolutely nothing but cold, hard boundary lines. He finally realized that the bridge was burned to the ground and the ashes had already blown away in the wind. He turned his back to the main house and began to walk. It was a slow, agonizing shuffle. His broad shoulders slumped forward. He dragged his feet heavily through the dirt. Trey walked about 10 paces behind him, keeping the camera lens perfectly steady. I watched them move slowly down the driveway. I watched my son shrink against the vastness of the 500 acres he had just foolishly thrown away. The Georgia heat was already rising rapidly, creating a visible, wavy shimmer over the long gravel road. Kendrick wiped his sweating face with his hand, stumbling slightly on a large rock, but he did not stop. He kept walking toward the main iron gates. I stood on the porch until they finally reached the very end of the property line. It took nearly 45 minutes. I watched carefully as Kendrick passed through the massive iron gates. I watched as he stepped out onto the paved shoulder of the main state highway. I was completely alone. He had no car, no wife, no money, and no family left to save him from his own greed. Trey stopped right at the property line. He stopped recording on his phone, turned around, and began the long walk back up to the main house. Silence returned to Freedom Hill Ranch. It was a heavy, complicated silence. It was the sound of a toxic tumor being surgically removed. The body aches from the procedure, but the deadly poison is finally gone. I walked back over to my large rocking chair. I picked up my glass of iced sweet tea. The ice cubes had melted, watering down the dark drink, but I took a long sip anyway. I looked out over the lower green pastures. Several of our beautiful champion quarter horses had moved close to the wooden fence line to graze on the fresh morning grass. Their brown coats shined brilliantly in the bright sun. The legacy was secure. The land was safe. I had successfully defended the powerful empire Jeremiah and I built together. Trey finally reached the front porch. He was breathing heavily from the long walk up the steep incline. He wiped the heavy sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He looked at me and offered a small, highly reassuring smile. He told me the main gates were officially locked and electronically secured. Kendrick was entirely gone. We had won the battle. I nodded my head, offering him a gentle, proud smile in return. I told him he did a phenomenal job today. I told him his grandfather would be incredibly proud of the strong, intelligent man he was becoming. Trey walked over to the top wooden step where he had left his heavy silver laptop and his mug of coffee. He reached down to pick up the computer. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the quiet morning air. It was a high-pitched, repetitive electronic alarm. The sound was coming directly from the speakers of Trey's laptop. It was not a gentle notification chime. It was a blaring, highly aggressive siren designed to indicate a massive critical emergency. Trey dropped straight to his knees on the wooden porch. He flipped the laptop screen open rapidly. His fingers flew across the keyboard, entering a complex series of administrative passwords. The bright blue screen reflected against his dark eyes. The small, reassuring smile he had worn just seconds ago vanished completely. His face contorted into a mask of pure, absolute panic. His chest heaved as he processed the digital data scrolling rapidly across his screen. I placed my glass of sweet tea down on the iron patio table with a loud, sharp clatter. I stood up from my rocking chair. The cold fire in my chest flared right back to life instantly. The war was not over. The enemy had merely changed his terrible tactics. "Trey," I demanded, my voice sharp and incredibly urgent. "What is happening? What is that alarm?" Trey looked up from the glowing screen. His eyes were wide with sheer terror. He grabbed the heavy laptop, clutching it tightly against his chest. He scrambled to his feet. "Big Mama!" Trey shouted, his voice cracking with pure adrenaline. "He is not done. He just triggered the banking alerts." I stared at the glowing blue screen of Trey's laptop. My heart began to pound a heavy, dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I did not ask him to repeat himself. I demanded to know exactly what he was looking at. Trey turned the computer toward me. His hands were moving so fast over the keyboard they were practically a blur. He explained that when he set up the cybersecurity protocols for the ranch, he did not just protect the email servers. He had placed a digital tripwire on all of my primary financial accounts at First Georgia Fidelity Bank. If anyone attempted to authorize a wire transfer over $10,000, Trey received an immediate high-priority encrypted alert. Right now, the alert was flashing bright red across his screen. Someone was standing inside the local branch of our bank, attempting to drain $300,000 in liquid cash from our primary operational reserves. I looked down the long dirt driveway. Kendrick had just walked out of the main gates 15 minutes ago. He must have flagged down a passing pickup truck on the state highway and hitched a ride directly into town. He was a desperate, cornered animal. His consulting business was bankrupt. His new bride had just abandoned him in the dirt. The corporate developers were calling the federal authorities to report him for wire fraud. He knew his entire life was completely over. He needed untraceable cash to run, and he was trying to steal it directly from the ranch's lifeblood. I grabbed Trey by the shoulder. I told him to leave the coffee and grab his computer. We sprinted down the wooden steps of the porch and jumped back into the black Jeep Cherokee. Trey did not even bother to buckle his seatbelt before he slammed his foot down on the gas pedal. The heavy tires spun violently in the gravel, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as we tore down the driveway. I braced my hand against the dashboard as we flew through the open iron gates and swerved hard onto the paved state highway. The local bank branch was exactly 12 miles away in the center of town. We had less than 15 minutes to stop a transaction that would completely destroy Freedom Hill Ranch. As Trey pushed the Jeep hard toward town, a wave of cold nausea washed over me. That operational account did not contain disposable spending money. It carried the cash that kept Freedom Hill alive from one month to the next payroll for our stable hands feed deliveries, veterinary bills, insurance premiums, repairs, and the reserve I had deliberately set aside for the Veterans Therapeutic Riding Program we were preparing to expand. $300,000 sounded enormous until you understood what it cost to keep 500 acres, dozens of horses, and community programs running without interruption. If Kendrick managed to wire that money beyond our reach, the ranch would not simply lose cash. Employees could miss checks, vendors could stop deliveries, and the very programs Jeremiah and I had built to serve other people could be forced to shut down. Kendrick was no longer trying to steal an inheritance he believed belonged to him someday. He was trying to strip the working heart out of Freedom Hill today. I asked Trey how it was even possible for Kendrick to access those funds. I am the sole signatory on that specific account. The bank manager knows me personally. They would never just hand over a certified wire transfer to my son without my direct verbal authorization. The protocols at that specific branch were notoriously strict. Trey kept his eyes glued to the road as he navigated a sharp curve. He told me that Kendrick must be using a forged power of attorney document. During the time Kendrick was pretending to run a successful consulting business, he had access to a massive amount of my old financial paperwork. Trey explained that Kendrick likely scanned an old tax return, digitally cloned the notary stamp, and printed a highly convincing legal document claiming that I was medically incapacitated and he was now in full control of my estate. Because Kendrick was wearing a highly expensive tailored suit and carrying himself with desperate corporate arrogance, a sleepy bank teller might actually believe his story. The sheer manipulation of it made me sick to my stomach. I pulled my cell phone out of my pocket. My hands were shaking with pure rage. I dialed the direct office line for the bank branch manager. The phone rang endlessly. It went straight to an automated voicemail system. I tried the main teller line. A pre-recorded message informed me that all representatives were currently busy assisting other customers. Kendrick was keeping them occupied. He was standing in that lobby right now, spinning a beautiful, tragic lie about his poor, senile mother failing in her old age. He was using the very woman who gave him life as a convenient excuse to commit federal bank fraud. First Georgia Fidelity was one of the few regional branches that kept limited Sunday hours for business clients, which was the only reason Kendrick's plan had any chance of working. The branch opened late in the morning with a skeleton staff, and longtime commercial customers could request urgent transfers in person. Kendrick knew that because he had watched me handle ranch emergencies there for years. He also knew the regular weekday compliance team would not be sitting in the building. In his mind, a quiet Sunday window made the fraud easier. To me, it made the timing terrifyingly clear he had not improvised this after leaving Freedom Hill. He had prepared the forged authority in advance and was simply moving to his next contingency the moment the land deal collapsed. I told Trey to drive faster. I told him I did not care if he got a speeding ticket. I would gladly pay the fine. The Georgia pines whipped past the windows in a dark green blur. The engine of the Jeep roared as we pushed it to its absolute limits. I looked out at the passing landscape and thought about the sheer audacity of my son. He had spent his entire life taking exactly what he wanted without a single thought for the collateral damage he left in his wake. He viewed the people who loved him not as family, but as disposable resources. I had spent 34 years making excuses for his bad behavior. Today the excuses officially ended. We hit the city limits of the small town. Trey slammed on the brakes, weaving the heavy vehicle aggressively through the light morning traffic. We turned sharply onto Main Street. The historic downtown area was quiet on a Sunday morning, but First Georgia Fidelity Bank was open for limited weekend hours. The bank was an old, distinguished brick building with massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked directly out onto the street. Trey whipped the Jeep into the bank parking lot. He did not even bother to look for a proper parking space. He drove the vehicle straight up over the concrete curb and parked diagonally across the front walkway directly in front of the main entrance doors. He threw the car into park and killed the engine. I did not wait for him to open my door. I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed the heavy passenger door open. My boots hit the pavement with a solid, determined thud. I looked straight through the massive glass windows of the bank. The bright fluorescent lights illuminated the entire lobby. It was completely empty of other customers. There was only one teller standing behind the polished wooden counter, and she was looking nervously toward the back offices. My eyes locked onto the branch manager's private office at the far end of the room. The office had glass walls designed to promote corporate transparency. Through that glass, I saw exactly what I had feared the most. Kendrick was sitting in a plush leather guest chair. His previously ruined designer suit had been quickly brushed off, though the knees of his trousers were still visibly stained with the dirt from my driveway. He was leaning forward over the branch manager's large oak desk. His posture was aggressive and commanding. He was using every ounce of his fake corporate charm to rush the transaction. The branch manager, a man I had known for 15 years, was looking down at a thick stack of printed paperwork. It was the forged power of attorney. I watched the manager nod slowly. He tapped a few keys on his computer keyboard. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a specialized wire transfer authorization form. He slid the legal document across the smooth wood of the desk, pushing it directly toward my son. Kendrick let out a visible sigh of massive relief. I could see the tension drop from his broad shoulders. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully stolen the ranch's operational reserves to fund his cowardly escape from the corporate developers and the federal authorities. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy gold pen. Trey came up behind me on the sidewalk. He slammed the door of the Jeep shut. He was holding his open laptop in his hands, the screen still displaying the active flashing red alerts from the compromised bank account. He looked through the glass window and saw his father holding the pen over the authorization form. I did not waste another single second. I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front bank door. I pulled it open with a massive surge of adrenaline. The small chime above the door rang out with a sharp, clear sound announcing our sudden arrival to the entire empty lobby. Kendrick had the gold pen pressed firmly against the signature line. He was exactly one signature away from completely destroying our family legacy and sending my business into federal bankruptcy. He looked up through the glass walls of the office. He saw me standing in the lobby. He completely froze. Trey walked right beside me. He held his heavy silver laptop tightly under his arm. The screen was still glowing brightly with the flashing red security alerts of the attempted wire transfer. We stepped further into the cool, air-conditioned lobby. The bank was practically empty on a Sunday morning. There was only one teller standing behind the thick security glass at the main counter. She was a sweet young woman named Chloe, who had handled the ranch payroll deposits for the past 5 years. She looked up with a polite, professional smile that instantly vanished the moment she saw the absolute thunder in my eyes. I walked straight up to her window. I placed both of my hands flat against the cold marble counter. I leaned in close so my voice would not carry across the entire room. "Good morning, Chloe," I said. My tone was perfectly level, but laced with undeniable danger. "I need you to reach under your desk right now and press the security button to electronically lock the main entrance doors. Absolutely nobody else comes in and nobody leaves until I tell you to unlock them." Chloe swallowed hard. Her eyes darted nervously toward the back offices, clearly sensing the massive tension radiating from my presence. She did not ask a single question. She trusted me implicitly. She reached under her desk and pressed the button. A loud, heavy metallic thunk echoed through the lobby as the thick steel deadbolt slid into place across the front glass doors. The physical trap was now officially sealed. My son was locked inside with the very woman he was attempting to destroy. I turned my back to the teller counter and walked directly toward the manager's office. The room had large glass walls designed to promote corporate transparency. Through that glass, I watched the branch manager, an older gentleman named David, stand up from his desk. David looked incredibly confused by the sudden commotion. He adjusted his suit jacket and took a step toward his door, preparing to come out and see what was happening. I did not give him the chance. I reached out, grabbed the silver handle, and pushed the glass door wide open myself. The air inside the small office was thick with the foul, sour stench of Kendrick's nervous sweat. "Beatrice," David said. His voice was laced with profound confusion as he looked from me to Kendrick and back again. "What on earth is going on here? Your son just sat in this chair and informed me that you had suffered a severe medical episode." He presented a legally binding power of attorney to manage the operational reserves for Freedom Hill. "He said you were completely incapacitated." I did not look at David. I kept my eyes entirely fixed on the pathetic, trembling man sitting in the guest chair. Kendrick was breathing so rapidly I thought his chest might burst. The heavy gold pen slipped from Kendrick's trembling fingers. It hit the polished surface of the branch manager's oak desk with a sharp clatter that echoed through the quiet bank. His jaw went slack. The smug, entitled arrogance that had defined his entire posture just seconds ago completely evaporated. He was staring at me as if a ghost had just walked through the front doors. I did not break eye contact. I kept my chin high and my shoulders pulled back, projecting the absolute authority of a woman who had spent 4 decades taming wild stallions and negotiating brutal land deals. "I am perfectly healthy, David," I stated firmly. My voice bounced off the glass walls, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "My mind is as sharp as a newly honed blade. That piece of paper sitting on your desk is a complete and total forgery. My son is currently attempting to commit federal bank fraud to steal $300,000 from the ranch's operational reserves." The remaining color completely drained from Kendrick's face. The sheer reality of his disastrous situation finally crashed down upon his shoulders. He was not just facing a ruined wedding or a failed consulting business. He was facing a massive federal prison sentence. Pure, unadulterated panic seized his entire body. He shot up out of the plush leather chair with such explosive force that he knocked the heavy piece of furniture backward into the glass wall. It hit the glass with a loud, violent crash. "Mom, please," Kendrick stammered. He raised both of his hands in a desperate begging gesture. "You simply do not understand the pressure I am under. I just needed to borrow the money to cover my debts. I was going to pay the ranch back. I swear to you on my life." He did not wait for my response. The primitive animal instinct to flee completely overpowered whatever small amount of logic he had left in his brain. Kendrick bolted toward the open office door. He tried to aggressively push past me to reach the main lobby. I stood my ground, bracing my boots against the carpet, forcing him to veer sharply to the side to avoid knocking me over. He stumbled wildly out into the main banking floor and began sprinting desperately toward the front entrance. "The doors are locked, Kendrick," I called out after him. My voice was completely devoid of any maternal sympathy. He reached the heavy glass doors and grabbed the brass handles. He yanked and pulled with all of his remaining strength. The electronic deadbolts held incredibly firm. The heavy metal rattled loudly but refused to open. Before he could turn around to look for another exit, the bank's armed security guard stepped forward. The guard was a retired military veteran named Marcus. Marcus regularly visited our therapeutic riding programs at the ranch, and he had absolutely no patience for a man trying to steal from that exact fund. Marcus placed a massive, heavy hand directly onto Kendrick's shoulder. He physically shoved my son backward away from the glass doors. "Step away from the exit, son," Marcus commanded with deep, rumbling authority. He unclipped the retention strap on his utility belt. "You are not going anywhere today." Back inside the glass office, David picked up the fraudulent legal document from his desk. His hands were visibly shaking as he examined the thick paper. He was a meticulous banker, and the reality of almost authorizing a fraudulent wire transfer terrified him. "Beatrice, this document has a certified state notary stamp pressed right onto the bottom of the page," David said. His voice was tight with rising professional anxiety. "It looks completely authentic. The signatures perfectly match the ones we have on file in our system. Making a false accusation of bank fraud is a very serious legal matter." David was trying to protect himself and the bank from massive corporate liability, but he was severely underestimating the technical intelligence of the young man standing right beside me. I stepped aside and motioned for my grandson to come forward. Trey walked calmly into the office. He looked like a highly trained digital forensic investigator preparing to systematically dismantle a crime scene. "It is not a sophisticated forgery at all, Mr. Davis," Trey stated confidently. He set his heavy silver laptop directly on top of the branch manager's desk. "It is actually a very sloppy, rushed digital clone. My father is incredibly careless with his digital footprint, and he clearly does not understand how metadata tracks every single action on a network." Trey tapped a few keys rapidly, bringing up a complex string of green code on his glowing screen. He turned the laptop so the bank manager could see it clearly. "When my father logged into the ranch's secure network yesterday to print this document," Trey explained methodically, "he left a massive digital trail right through our firewalls. I was able to track exactly what files he accessed. He pulled up an old property tax return from 4 years ago. It was a document that you actually notarized yourself, Mr. Davis. He used a basic, cheap photo editing software to digitally crop your specific notary seal and your signature. He then pasted that copied seal directly onto this fake power of attorney template. Trey pressed another button. The screen instantly displayed a side-by-side digital comparison of the two documents. It highlighted the exact areas of manipulation. "Look closely at the pixelation around the edges of the blue ink," Trey instructed, pointing at the screen. "You can clearly see the digital artifacts where the image was compressed to fit the new page. Furthermore, the embedded metadata on the file shows that this document was created exactly at 2:14 in the morning today. That is physically impossible for a document that claims to have been notarized last Thursday afternoon." David leaned in close, his eyes scanning the irrefutable digital evidence displayed on the laptop. He let out a long, heavy breath, completely stunned by the technical breakdown. The undeniable proof completely destroyed Kendrick's entire desperate lie. My son had walked into a federally insured bank and committed a massive, undeniable felony. "My God," David whispered. He dropped the fraudulent paper onto the desk as if it had suddenly caught fire. He looked out through the glass walls at Kendrick, who was now sitting defeated on the lobby floor with his head buried in his hands, heavily guarded by Marcus. The manager reached out with a trembling hand and picked up his desk telephone. "I am legally obligated to report this to the authorities immediately." "Make the call, David," I said quietly. I did not flinch. I did not hesitate. I was cutting the rot out of my family tree once and for all. Kendrick heard the manager picking up the phone. He began to sob loudly from the lobby floor. He raised his head, his face completely stained with tears and sweat. "Mom, please!" Kendrick screamed, his voice breaking in total agony. "You have to tell them not to call the police. You have to save me. It was all her. Valerie made me do it. She told me we needed the cash to escape the developers. She planned the entire thing." I looked at him with absolute disgust. He was still trying to push the blame onto someone else. He refused to take accountability for his own greedy choices. Beside me, Trey suddenly gasped loudly. He was staring intently at his laptop screen. While we were talking to the manager, Trey had continued to dig deeper into the files he pulled from Kendrick's cloned hard drive. He was scrolling rapidly through a hidden folder he had just decrypted. The color completely drained from my grandson's young face. "Grandma," Trey whispered. His voice was shaking with profound shock. He turned the laptop toward me, his eyes wide with a terrifying new realization. Valerie is much worse than we thought. I looked down at the glowing screen of Trey's laptop. He pulled up a hidden folder filled with offshore bank routing numbers and scanned passports. Valerie was not just a superficial socialite obsessed with designer labels. She was a highly calculated professional grifter. She had 3 different legal aliases. The documents showed a clear, devastating pattern. She married into wealthy families, pushed her new husbands to aggressively liquidate generational assets, and then completely vanished with the cash. She had done this twice before in different states. Furthermore, Trey found her flight confirmations. She had already booked a one-way first-class ticket to Dubai for the following Tuesday. She never intended to stay with Kendrick. She had been secretly siphoning thousands of dollars from his failing consulting firm for months. Just as Kendrick processed this terrifying information, the heavy glass doors of the bank rattled. The local police had arrived. David quickly unlocked the doors. 2 officers marched inside and immediately placed Kendrick in heavy steel handcuffs. As they read him his rights, I turned the laptop screen so he could see Valerie's flight itinerary to Dubai. I wanted him to understand the full weight of his foolishness. He stopped crying. He stared at the screen in absolute hollow shock. He finally realized that his entire life, his ultimate betrayal of his own mother, was all for a ghost who never truly loved him. The officers hauled him out of the bank. The officers did not treat Trey's laptop like a toy or his discovery like family gossip. Before they removed Kendrick from the building, they photographed the forged power of attorney, preserved the transfer form he had nearly signed, and asked Trey to provide a read-only copy of the relevant server logs. I made sure he handed over copies rather than altering anything on the ranch system. We had spent the entire morning protecting evidence, and I was not about to let anger contaminate the case now. David froze every outgoing transfer from the operational account until I could complete a fresh identity verification, and the bank placed an internal fraud alert on every profile connected to Freedom Hill. For the first time that day, I knew the money itself was safe. What none of us understood yet was how far Valerie's scheme reached beyond my son. 2 nights later, the heavy summer heat settled over Freedom Hill Ranch. The crickets chirped loudly in the tall grass. I was fast asleep in my master bedroom on the ground floor. I had spent the last 48 hours speaking with Mr. Sterling and securing the ranch against any further legal threats. I thought the worst of the storm had finally passed. I assumed my son was sitting in a cold county jail cell awaiting his federal arraignment. I was terribly wrong. Kendrick had not stayed in jail. He had managed to make a single phone call from the precinct. He did not call a reputable bail bondsman. He called a highly dangerous, shadowy loan shark operating out of downtown Atlanta. He already owed this ruthless man a significant amount of money from his failed consulting business. The loan shark paid the massive bail, but it came with a lethal condition. Kendrick now had exactly 48 hours to produce the cash he owed, plus a massive interest fee, or he would face severe physical consequences. Kendrick was completely desperate. His accounts were frozen. His wife had abandoned him. He was facing federal wire fraud charges. He had absolutely nowhere to go and no one left to manipulate. But he remembered one final desperate lifeline. He remembered the heavy steel floor safe hidden beneath the oak floorboards in his father's private study. Jeremiah had kept a sizable stack of untraceable municipal bearer bonds in that safe for absolute emergencies. If Kendrick could get his hands on those bonds, he could pay off the dangerous loan shark and buy a fake passport to disappear across the border. He made one last fatal mistake. He decided to break into his childhood home. At 2 a.m, the ranch was completely silent. I was sleeping peacefully, but Trey was wide awake. My grandson was sitting in his dark bedroom on the 2nd floor. The blue light from his computer monitors illuminated his focused face. He was running a full diagnostic sweep of our upgraded cybersecurity network. After the incident at the bank, Trey had integrated our digital firewalls with the physical security cameras and motion sensors spread across the 500 acres of the property. Trey watched the live feed on his left monitor. Everything was perfectly quiet. Then a small yellow alert popped up on his screen. The perimeter motion sensors located at the far back edge of the ranch house suddenly went completely offline. It was not a mechanical failure. Someone had physically cut the hardwired connection to the exterior floodlights. Trey did not panic. He simply zoomed in on the secondary hidden infrared cameras he had installed in the trees near the back porch. A dark figure was creeping silently across the back lawn. The man was dressed entirely in black clothing. He moved with the desperate, hurried caution of a cornered animal. Trey recognized the broad shoulders and the familiar gait immediately. It was his father. Kendrick had returned to Freedom Hill. Kendrick approached the back of the massive house. He bypassed the heavy front doors and headed directly for the old mudroom entrance. He knew the layout of this historic house better than anyone else in the world. He knew that the mudroom door had an older mechanical lock that was highly susceptible to being forced open. What he did not know was that Trey had installed a silent magnetic tripwire inside the doorframe just yesterday afternoon. Kendrick pulled a heavy steel crowbar from his dark jacket. He jammed it violently into the wooden doorframe. He pressed his entire weight against the cold metal, prying the thick wood apart until the old brass lock finally gave way with a loud, sickening crack. He slipped inside the dark mudroom, leaving the damaged door hanging open behind him. He stepped out of his heavy boots so his footsteps would not echo on the polished hardwood floors. He moved through the dark kitchen in his socks. He navigated the familiar hallways, blindly relying on decades of childhood memory to avoid bumping into the antique furniture his father had built by hand. I was sweating profusely. His heart pounded aggressively against his ribs. He knew perfectly well that if he was caught breaking into the house while out on bail, his federal sentence would instantly double in length. But the threat of the Atlanta loan shark waiting for him in the city was far more terrifying than a federal judge. He desperately needed those untraceable bearer bonds to buy his absolute freedom. He crept past the grand wooden staircase, entirely unaware that Trey was sitting just a few feet above him, tracking his every single movement through the interior night vision cameras. Kendrick finally reached the heavy mahogany doors of Jeremiah's private study. This specific room had always been strictly off-limits to him as a child, unless he was formally invited inside. It was a sacred place of serious business and quiet reflection for his father. He grabbed the brass handles. They were locked tightly. He cursed under his breath. He raised the heavy steel crowbar again and wedged it between the beautiful double doors. He pushed hard, putting all of his desperate weight into the metal tool. The premium wood splintered loudly. The locking mechanism snapped, and the heavy doors swung open into the pitch-black room. Kendrick slipped inside, breathing heavily. He dropped the crowbar onto the expensive carpet. He dropped to his hands and knees and crawled aggressively toward the massive oak desk sitting in the exact center of the room. He ran his shaking hands over the polished floorboards beneath the desk, feeling carefully for the familiar hidden groove. He found the secret metal latch and pulled the wooden panel back. The heavy steel dial of the hidden floor safe was ice-cold against his sweaty fingers. He let out a ragged, pathetic sigh of sheer relief. He leaned forward in the dark, preparing to spin the heavy dial, crack the combination, and finally claim his stolen salvation. He thought he had successfully outsmarted everyone one final time. He thought he had finally won. Suddenly, with a sharp, explosive click, the massive overhead chandelier snapped on. The room flooded with blinding, brilliant light. Kendrick recoiled, throwing his hands up over his eyes to shield them from the sudden, searing brightness. His heart stopped dead in his chest. He was kneeling like a caught thief on his own father's favorite rug. As his vision slowly adjusted to the painful glare, he realized with absolute bone-chilling terror that the large private study was not empty. I was not alone. The very last desperate thread of his broken life was about to be permanently severed. Someone was waiting for him in the corner, watching his every pathetic move in total, unrelenting silence. The ultimate reckoning had officially arrived at Freedom Hill Ranch tonight. The harsh glare of the crystal chandelier flooded the room, pinning Kendrick to the floor like an insect under a microscope. He scrambled backward in a sheer panic. His heavy leather boots scraped wildly for traction against the polished oak floorboards. His chest heaved violently as he threw his right arm up to shield his eyes from the sudden piercing brightness. As his vision slowly adjusted to the intense light, the true, inescapable terror of his situation fully crystallized in front of him. I was sitting perfectly still in Jeremiah's oversized burgundy leather armchair. A delicate porcelain cup of chamomile tea rested steadily in my right hand. The steam rose softly into the cool, air-conditioned air of the private study. I wore a heavy navy blue silk robe. My posture was entirely relaxed, but completely unyielding. I did not look surprised by his sudden intrusion. I looked exactly like a seasoned judge, patiently waiting for a guilty verdict to be read aloud in a courtroom. Standing by the heavy mahogany doors he had just violently splintered with a steel crowbar was Trey. My grandson did not look at his father with fear, and he did not look at him with anger. He looked at him with profound, irreversible pity. Trey held his smartphone firmly in his right hand. The screen was brightly illuminated, displaying an active call timer counting the seconds. The call was already connected directly to the county emergency police dispatch. Kendrick dropped his hands limply to his sides. The heavy steel crowbar slipped from his grasp. It landed on the expensive Persian rug with a dull thud, creating a damning piece of physical evidence he could never possibly explain away to a jury. He looked frantically from me to Trey. His mouth kept opening and closing like a dying fish pulled from a deep river. He was breathing so fast he was practically choking on the oxygen in the room. "Mom!" Kendrick stammered, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. "Mom, please put the phone down right now. Tell Trey to hang up the phone immediately. You do not understand what is happening to me. I had to come back here tonight. I have absolutely no other choice left in the world." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my hot tea. The delicate porcelain cup clicked softly against the matching saucer. "I understand the situation perfectly, Kendrick," I replied. My voice was perfectly smooth and entirely devoid of any maternal warmth. "You were just bailed out of a federal holding cell by a highly violent loan shark who operates his illegal business out of downtown Atlanta. You owe this dangerous man a massive amount of money that you simply do not have. Your high-end consulting business is a complete financial graveyard. Your gold-digging grifter bride has permanently abandoned you for a luxury flight to Dubai. You suddenly remembered your late father's emergency bearer bonds hidden in this floor safe, and you recklessly decided that breaking into your childhood home in the dead of night was your final brilliant escape plan." Kendrick stared at me, completely horrified by my words. He had absolutely no idea how I knew the intricate, secretive details of his desperate life. He did not realize that Trey had spent the entire afternoon legally pulling the digital records from his seized corporate accounts. We knew every single illicit debt he owed. We knew exactly who he had called from the police precinct to secure his bail. The crushing realization that he was completely trapped finally shattered the very last remaining pieces of his sanity. Kendrick completely broke down. He did not just cry, he collapsed into a sobbing, trembling, pathetic mess right on the floor of his father's sacred study. But even in his absolute rock-bottom moment, he stubbornly refused to take any real accountability for his actions. He immediately began to deflect the blame onto everyone else. "It is not my fault," Kendrick screamed, hitting his clenched fists aggressively against the oak floorboards. "You have absolutely no idea how incredibly hard it is to be Jeremiah Washington's only son. You have no idea the immense pressure I was constantly under to be highly successful. I am a black man trying to survive and thrive in high society corporate America. Do you know what it actually takes to get those wealthy people to respect you? You have to wear the absolute right designer suits. You have to drive the absolute right luxury cars. You have to live in the most expensive zip code in the city. I had to project massive wealth just to get a basic seat at their table." He pointed a shaking, accusatory finger directly at my face. "And you never once helped me," he sobbed. His voice was thickly laced with bitter, unearned resentment. "You and Dad sat on millions of dollars of land equity out here in the country, playing in the dirt with farm animals. When my consulting business started failing, you could have easily just given me the cash. You could have effortlessly written me a check and saved my professional pride. But no, you actively made me beg for it. You made me look like a total failure in front of Valerie. You pushed me into a dark corner. Society pushed me into a dark corner. I only tried to sell this ranch to the developers because you aggressively refused to give me the financial backing I rightfully deserved." I slowly set my delicate teacup down on the small wooden side table. I stood up from the comfortable leather armchair. I drew myself up to my full, imposing height. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man groveling on the floor. I prepared to deliver a brutal reality check that would echo loudly in his ears for the rest of his miserable life. "You actually dare to blame society for your own selfish greed," I stated firmly. My voice echoed off the polished wood-paneled walls with lethal, undeniable authority. "You actually dare to blame your late father for the heavy pressure of his good, honest name. Let me tell you exactly what your brave father did, Kendrick. Jeremiah grew up in a tiny house with no indoor plumbing. He wore worn-out shoes with massive holes in the soles. He faced a cruel society that actively tried to crush his spirit every single time he stepped out of his front door. But he did not buy expensive designer suits to desperately impress people who secretly hated him. He bought land. He bought dirt. He built a mighty fortress for our family. I took a slow, deliberate step closer to him. My eyes were burning with absolute, unwavering conviction. Generational wealth is not a blank check to fund your laziness. I commanded, ensuring he heard every single sharp syllable clearly. It is not a magical trust fund designed to finance your luxury leased vehicles or your desperate, pathetic need for high society validation. True generational wealth is a sacred trust. It is a powerful protective shield built entirely from the blood, sweat, and endless tears of your hardworking ancestors. It is meant to uplift your children and permanently secure your community. It is meant to provide a solid, unshakable foundation, not a careless playground for a foolish boy. Kendrick shrank back away from me. He was clearly terrified by the raw, dominant power radiating from my steady posture. I paid $120,000 in cash for your lavish wedding, I continued. My voice was steady and completely unyielding. I gave you a completely debt-free college education. I gave you a pristine family name. And what exactly did you do with those profound, incredible advantages? You treated your grand legacy like a cheap casino chip. You threw away your sacred birthright to impress a professional grifter who was actively stealing your money behind your back. You willingly attempted to sell a peaceful sanctuary for broken children to commercial land developers just so you could pretend to be a wealthy corporate tycoon. You are not a helpless victim, Kendrick. You are a profoundly weak, foolish man who completely destroyed his own powerful empire simply because he was far too lazy to defend it. Kendrick buried his wet face deep in his shaking hands. The sheer, undeniable truth of my harsh words crushed whatever remaining fragile defense he had built up in his delusional mind. He knew I was absolutely right. He had foolishly traded a kingdom of honest dirt and family honor for a completely hollow, meaningless life of fake luxury, and now he was going to lose absolutely everything. From the quiet darkness outside the large study window, a faint, high-pitched sound suddenly began to bleed into the quiet night air. It was a terrifying, wailing sound. It was distant at first, but it was growing steadily louder and more aggressive with every single passing second. Bright red and blue lights began to reflect faintly against the dark leaves of the distant tree line. The county sheriff deputies were racing aggressively down the main state highway toward Freedom Hill Ranch. Trey had given the emergency dispatcher our exact GPS coordinates the very moment Kendrick used a crowbar to pry open the back mudroom door. The police knew that a federal fraud suspect who was currently out on bail had just committed a violent, highly illegal breaking and entering felony. Kendrick heard the loud sirens. He instantly recognized the terrifying, unmistakable sound of his absolute doom rapidly approaching the house. The physical reality of a massive federal prison sentence suddenly hit his body with the sheer force of a physical blow. He snapped his head up instantly. His tear-stained face went completely sickly pale with ultimate paralyzing terror. He scrambled forward on his knees. He crawled desperately across the beautiful Persian rug. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my navy blue silk robe with trembling, desperate hands. "Mom, please," Kendrick begged. His voice broke into a hysterical, high-pitched scream of total despair. "Please, you cannot let them take me back to a federal holding cell tonight. They will permanently deny my bail. I will be locked away in a cell for 15 years. You have to tell them I have your permission to be here. Tell the police I simply lost my keys. Tell them you invited me over for a late drink. Please, Mom, I am your only son. You have to lie to them for me. You have to save my life right now." I looked down at his shaking hands gripping the bottom of my silk robe. I did not move an inch. I did not offer him a single ounce of maternal comfort. The aggressive sirens wailed louder, turning sharply down the long dirt driveway, racing directly toward the front porch. The flashing red and blue police lights brilliantly illuminated the grand glass windows of the study. The final, inescapable consequence had officially arrived. The heavy front doors of the ranch house swung open with a violent crash. Heavy footsteps pounded against the hardwood floors of the hallway. 3 armed county sheriff deputies burst into the private study with their weapons drawn and their tactical flashlights cutting through the bright glare of the chandelier. They found exactly what Trey had reported to the emergency dispatcher. A desperate man dressed in dark clothing surrounded by the splintered wood of a broken door, kneeling on the floor of a restricted room. Kendrick did not try to run. He did not have the physical strength or the emotional capacity left to fight them. He stayed on his knees, his hands still gripping the bottom hem of my silk robe. I looked down at him completely unmoved by his tears, and I smoothly pulled my fabric out of his desperate grasp. I took 2 deliberate steps backward, physically and emotionally, detaching myself from the man he had chosen to become. The lead deputy marched forward and grabbed Kendrick by the shoulders. He hauled my son roughly to his feet and slammed him face first against the oak-paneled wall of the study. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing in the room was the sound of a generational legacy actively defending itself. Kendrick cried out, pressing his cheek against the beautiful wood his father had polished by hand. He begged the deputies to listen to him. He screamed that this was his family home and he had every right to be there. The deputy ignored his frantic protests completely. He read Kendrick his Miranda rights in a bored, monotone voice that indicated he had dealt with pathetic criminals 1,000 times before. He listed the severe charges clearly. Kendrick was being formally arrested for felony breaking and entering, malicious destruction of private property, and violating the strict terms of his federal bail. Because he had already committed wire fraud and attempted bank fraud earlier that very same day, his temporary freedom was officially revoked. There would be no shady loan sharks coming to save him tonight. There would be no bail hearing in the morning. He was going directly into a maximum security holding cell. They dragged him out of the study. His expensive boots dragged uselessly across the expensive Persian rug. He looked over his shoulder at me one final time as the deputies pulled him through the shattered doorway. He was waiting for a mother to save her child. He found a matriarch fiercely protecting her empire instead. The heavy front doors closed behind them, shutting out the wailing sirens. Freedom Hill Ranch fell back into a deep, peaceful silence. I would later read the exact word-for-word legal transcripts of what happened next in that cold downtown Atlanta interrogation room. The federal authorities did not waste a single second with my son. By 4 a.m, Kendrick was sitting at a scarred metal table in a windowless room with his hands cuffed to the iron bracket on the floor. He was shivering in his ruined clothes. The arrogant corporate consultant who had demanded a $120,000 wedding was entirely gone. Detective Morris, a seasoned financial crimes investigator with absolutely no patience for high society criminals, walked into the interrogation room. He dropped a massive, thick manila folder directly onto the metal table. The loud slap of the paper made Kendrick jump in his seat. Morris did not sit down. He stood over my son, projecting the exact same dominant, unyielding authority I had used on the porch. Morris laid out the absolute, undeniable reality of Kendrick's disastrous situation. He informed my son that the commercial developers had successfully filed their federal wire fraud charges. The bank manager had handed over the forged power of attorney document alongside the digital metadata Trey had expertly pulled from the network. The loan shark who posted his initial bail was already being tracked by a federal task force. Kendrick was looking at a minimum of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He would lose his absolute prime years locked inside a concrete box. He would have no designer suits, no imported champagne, and no fancy corporate titles. Kendrick broke completely. The incredibly fragile illusion of his massive ego shattered into a million tiny, irreparable pieces on that cold interrogation room floor. He finally realized that his entire life was over if he did not cooperate. He realized that the woman he had abandoned his family for had played him for an absolute fool from the very first day they met. He looked up at Detective Morris with red, swollen eyes. To save himself from serving the absolute maximum sentence, my son made the only logical choice he had left. He offered them a deal. He offered to turn state witness against his new bride. Kendrick demanded a plea agreement, and in exchange he promised to hand the federal authorities the exact location and the entire criminal blueprint of a highly sought-after serial grifter. Morris pulled out a tape recorder, pressed the red button, and told Kendrick to start talking. My son spilled absolutely everything. He gave the detectives all 3 of Valerie's known legal aliases. He confirmed the offshore bank routing numbers that Trey had previously discovered, hidden deep in his cloned hard drive. But the most devastating piece of information Kendrick provided was the exact, intricate methodology of how Valerie had manipulated the wedding expenses to wash stolen money. I had paid $120,000 for that lavish reception, but I had paid those funds directly into an escrow account managed by Valerie's chosen wedding planner. Kendrick confessed that Valerie had aggressively insisted on using her own preferred vendors for the floral arrangements, the custom catering, and the luxury venue decorations. He revealed to the shocked detectives that those specific vendors did not actually exist. They were fraudulent shell companies created entirely by Valerie. She had systematically generated fake invoices overcharged for basic services and siphoned tens of thousands of dollars of my clean money directly into her untraceable overseas accounts. She had essentially used her own luxury wedding as an incredibly sophisticated money laundering operation right under his nose. Furthermore, she had been doing the exact same thing to Kendrick's consulting firm for the past 8 months. She had disguised massive cash withdrawals as corporate marketing expenses, completely bankrupting his business while making him believe it was just a slow quarter in the market. She drained his entire life, orchestrated the theft of my land to secure one final massive $4 million payout, and planned to leave him to take the absolute fall for all the federal crimes. Detective Morris wrote furiously on his yellow legal pad. He stopped the tape recorder and immediately grabbed his radio. He commanded his team to run the 3 aliases Kendrick had just provided through the National Federal Database and the Transportation Security Flight Manifests. He knew that professional grifters with offshore accounts never stayed in one place for very long after a scam imploded. Kendrick sat slumped in his metal chair, his head resting against the cold table. He had sold his soul, his father's legacy, and his mother's profound love for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient financial stepping stone. He wept loudly in the quiet room, mourning a terrible ghost. Outside the interrogation room, the busy precinct suddenly erupted into frantic, highly coordinated action. Detective Morris burst through the heavy doors and ran straight to the digital command center. A young federal analyst was typing rapidly on a glowing computer monitor. The analyst had cross-referenced Valerie's primary alias with the international flight manifests for the entire eastern seaboard. A bright green notification flashed violently across the analyst's large computer screen. They had a direct, undeniable hit. Detective Morris leaned over the desk, reading the flight information out loud to the surrounding task force. Valerie was not gone yet. She had not managed to slip completely through the cracks of the justice system. She was currently sitting comfortably in the exclusive first-class VIP lounge at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. She was likely sipping complimentary champagne, enjoying the expensive air conditioning, and waiting to board a direct one-way flight to Dubai. She thought she had successfully executed the perfect crime. She thought she was entirely untouchable. She had no idea that a heavily armed team of federal agents and local police officers were currently sprinting toward their tactical vehicles, preparing to completely destroy her luxurious escape plan. Valerie sat cross-legged in a plush armchair inside the exclusive first-class lounge at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. The air conditioning masked the chaotic roar of the terminals below. She held a crystal flute of vintage champagne, taking a satisfying sip to wash away the disgusting memory of the dust at Freedom Hill Ranch. She looked out the soundproof windows at the tarmac. A massive jet was currently being fueled for a direct flight to Dubai. Her boarding pass, printed under her most reliable legal alias, rested securely inside her designer handbag. She felt a profound rush of victory. Kendrick had been the absolute easiest mark of her professional career. He was so incredibly desperate for high society validation that manipulating him felt entirely effortless. She had not secured the $4 million land payout, but she was not walking away empty-handed. She had successfully utilized his lavish $120,000 wedding to wash clean cash through her network of fake catering shell companies. Combined with the money she aggressively siphoned from his dying consulting firm, she secured over $300,000 untraceable dollars. The money was already resting safely in her offshore accounts. She had drained him dry, ruined his relationship with his mother, and successfully slipped away just hours before the fragile house of cards completely collapsed. She checked the gold watch on her wrist. She had exactly 40 minutes until boarding commenced. She signaled the bartender for another pour of champagne, smiling to herself. She thought she was entirely invisible. She was so wrapped up in her own arrogant fantasies that she did not notice the heavy glass doors of the lounge swing open. She did not notice the terrifying silence that fell over the wealthy business travelers at the surrounding tables. She only noticed something was terribly wrong when a massive dark shadow fell directly over her champagne flute. Valerie looked up, an annoyed remark already forming on her glossed lips. The words died instantly in her throat. She was not looking at an overly attentive bartender. She was looking directly at the tactical vest of a heavily armed federal agent. Before her brain could process the sheer reality of the threat, the entire exclusive lounge was suddenly swarming with law enforcement. 6 federal agents and 4 uniformed Atlanta police officers had completely locked down the room. 2 agents flanked her leather chair. A female officer stepped directly in front of her, entirely blocking any possible avenue of escape. The officer did not smile. She reached down, grabbed Valerie by the arm, and hauled her roughly to her feet. Valerie tried to protest. She loudly demanded to know what they were doing and threatened to call her corporate lawyers. She claimed they had mistaken her for someone else. The female officer ignored her entirely. She spun Valerie around and secured her wrists tightly in cold, heavy steel handcuffs. Another agent snatched Valerie's expensive designer handbag from the glass table. He dumped the contents directly onto the floor of the luxury lounge. The evidence of her entire criminal life spilled out for everyone to see. 3 different passports, each bearing a distinct legal name, hit the carpet. Stacks of bundled $100 bills scattered across the floor. A prepaid burner phone followed. The lead federal agent picked up one of the forged passports and looked directly into Valerie's wide, terrified eyes. He read her real original birth name aloud. He calmly informed her that her offshore accounts had already been fully identified and officially frozen by international authorities. He told her that her foolish husband was currently sitting in an interrogation room downtown, loudly singing like a canary to secure a plea deal. Kendrick had surrendered her entire network of fake wedding vendors and dummy corporations. She had thought her husband was just a pathetic, useful idiot. She did not realize that a cornered idiot will always turn on their master to save their own skin. The officer read Valerie her Miranda rights in front of the completely silent crowd of wealthy travelers. The perfect, untouchable facade she had spent years carefully constructing was entirely obliterated in a matter of seconds. She was going directly to a sterile concrete federal holding cell. They marched her forcefully out of the lounge in heavy handcuffs. 80 miles away, the quiet evening had settled deeply over Freedom Hill Ranch. I was sitting at the heavy oak dining table in the main house. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Trey was sitting directly across from me. His heavy silver laptop was still open, but his hands were finally resting quietly. The digital war we fought all day was paused. We were simply waiting for the final definitive outcome. My cell phone sat directly in the center of the wooden table. When the screen illuminated and the sharp ringtone echoed through the kitchen, neither of us jumped. I reached out smoothly and answered the call, placing it immediately on speakerphone so my grandson could hear every word. "Mrs. Washington," Detective Morris said. His voice sounded tired but deeply satisfied. "I am calling to give you an official update on the situation." "I am listening, Detective," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight. "We got her," Morris stated bluntly. "Federal agents apprehended Valerie in the first-class lounge at the airport exactly 20 minutes ago. She had multiple forged passports and stolen cash directly on her person. We also initiated an emergency international freeze on the offshore accounts she used to launder your wedding funds. We caught her right before she boarded a flight to Dubai. She is currently in federal custody." I let out a long, slow breath. The suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest since Kendrick marched up to my table finally began to lift. "And my son?" I asked quietly. It was the hardest question I had asked all day. "He is fully cooperating," Morris answered. "He provided the exact aliases and routing numbers we needed to corner her. He is still facing serious federal charges for attempted bank fraud and wire fraud involving those corporate land developers, but his cooperation tonight will certainly be factored into his sentencing hearing. He will remain in custody without bail." "Thank you for moving so quickly today," I said. "Do not thank me, Mrs. Washington," Morris replied with a heavy sigh. "Thank your grandson. The digital footprint he provided from those cloned hard drives gave us the exact probable cause we needed to secure emergency federal warrants. Without that metadata, she would be halfway over the Atlantic Ocean right now." I reached out and ended the call. The line went completely dead. I looked across the table at Trey. He slowly reached out and pressed the screen of his silver laptop downward until it clicked shut. The bright blue glow vanished from his tired face. A small, deeply satisfied smile touched the corners of his mouth. The digital trail he had meticulously gathered and perfectly weaponized had ensured the woman who tried to destroy our family could not slip through the cracks of the justice system. He had protected his grandfather's sacred legacy. The immediate critical threat to Freedom Hill Ranch was completely neutralized. The land was safe. The bank accounts were totally secure. The dangerous predators who had tried to pave over our history were currently sitting in cold concrete cells. We had unequivocally won the battle. But as I sat in the quiet kitchen, the profound emotional wreckage of the day finally began to settle heavily over my spirit. I had saved my empire, but I had permanently lost my only son in the process. I had been forced to stand by and watch Kendrick completely destroy his own life out of pure, unfiltered greed. The legal victory was absolute, but the maternal heartbreak was a deep bleeding wound that would take a very long time to properly heal. I stood up from the heavy oak table and walked slowly over to the large kitchen window. I looked out at the dark, sprawling pastures of the ranch. The moon was shining brightly over the southern tree line. The storm had finally broken against our reinforced walls, and the walls had held firm. The upcoming federal court date was officially set. The final brutal reckoning was still waiting for us on the horizon, but tonight the land belonged entirely to us. We had successfully survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable. Tomorrow morning we would begin the very hard, rewarding work of rebuilding everything they tried to destroy. Exactly 3 months later, the heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta closed with a deep, echoing thud. The sheer silence inside the courtroom was heavy and absolute. The walls were lined with polished mahogany, projecting a cold, unforgiving authority that matched the severe reality of the day. I sat in the front row of the gallery. My posture was completely straight, my hands folded neatly in my lap over a simple leather purse. I wore a tailored black suit. I was not there to mourn, and I was certainly not there to celebrate. I was there to witness the final consequences of ultimate betrayal. At the defense table to my left sat Valerie. She was no longer wearing custom designer silk or glittering diamond jewelry. She wore a standard-issue gray detention uniform. Her hair was pulled back tightly, exposing the harsh, angry lines of her face. She glared fiercely at everyone in the room, radiating a toxic, unrepentant fury. She still believed she was the ultimate victim of a terrible misunderstanding. She looked at the federal prosecutor, she looked at the judge, and she glared directly at me with pure venom. I did not flinch. I looked right through her, as if she were completely transparent. A few feet away, seated at a separate table with his public defender, was my son. Kendrick was wearing a bright orange prison jumpsuit. The vibrant color looked unnatural. His shoulders were slumped forward, making him look incredibly small and entirely defeated. The arrogant corporate consultant who had demanded a lavish wedding and thrown me out of the country club was totally gone. He looked exhausted, hollow, and utterly broken. He kept his head down, staring blankly at his chained wrists resting on the wooden table. He could not bring himself to look back at the gallery. He could not bear to look at the mother he had so foolishly attempted to destroy. The bailiff announced the arrival of the honorable federal judge. We all stood up as a stern, distinguished woman in a flowing black robe took her seat at the elevated bench. The judge adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the massive stacks of legal files summarizing my son's catastrophic choices and Valerie's extensive documented history of serial fraud. The judge cleared her throat, breaking the heavy tension in the massive room. She formally stated that before she handed down the final sentencing for the defendants, the court would hear from the primary victim of the financial conspiracy. The federal prosecutor turned toward the gallery and called my name. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my black jacket. I walked down the center aisle, my low heels clicking steadily against the polished floorboards. I walked past Valerie, ignoring her sharp, bitter scoff. I walked past Kendrick, who visibly shrank away from my passing shadow. I stepped up into the witness box and took my seat. A microphone was positioned directly in front of me. I leaned forward slightly. I did not look at the judge. I did not look at the prosecutor. I turned my head and looked directly at the man I had given birth to. When I spoke, my voice carried absolutely no hatred. It held no lingering malice or vindictive spite. It carried the profound, heavy sorrow of a grieving mother and the fierce, unyielding strength of a generational protector. I told the silent courtroom about Freedom Hill Ranch. I did not just talk about the acreage or the market value. I told them the actual history of that sacred soil. I explained how my late husband Jeremiah grew up in a world that constantly told him he was entirely worthless. I spoke about Jeremiah's grandfather, a proud black man who worked as a sharecropper in the brutal, unrelenting southern heat for 30 long years just to save enough pennies to buy his very first acre of dirt. I told the judge how black farmers in Georgia had to fight tooth and nail against systemic discrimination, predatory lenders, and violent intimidation just to hold on to their legal property. Every single blade of grass on Freedom Hill was bought with the blood, the sweat, and the unimaginable sacrifice of our ancestors. Jeremiah and I spent 40 years honoring that sacrifice. We built a beautiful sanctuary. We bred strong horses, and we opened our massive gates to inner-city youth who desperately needed to see what true freedom looked like. We taught those vulnerable children how to ride, how to trust, and how to build a legacy of their own. We built an empire of healing and generational wealth. Then I pointed my finger directly at Kendrick. I told the court exactly what my son had done to that profound legacy. I explained how Kendrick had looked at a half-century of black excellence and saw nothing but a quick, convenient casino chip. He had treated the sacred graves of his ancestors like a disposable commercial commodity. He had actively tried to sell our peaceful sanctuary to the highest corporate bidder simply because he was too arrogant to admit his own business was failing. He tried to pave over the grass where broken children learned to heal all so he could buy the temporary shallow affection of a professional grifter who actively despised our family. I told the judge that generational wealth is not an automatic blank check for laziness. It is a profound, sacred trust. When a man attempts to burn down his own family tree for a quick payout, he must be allowed to stand entirely alone in the bitter cold of his own making. I did not ask the judge for leniency. I did not ask for mercy. I told the court that true love sometimes requires allowing a person to face the absolute maximum consequence of their own disastrous greed. I finished my statement, stood up from the wooden witness box, and walked calmly back to my seat in the front row of the gallery. The entire courtroom was perfectly silent. The federal judge removed her glasses. She looked down at the two defendants with an expression of absolute, unadulterated judicial disgust. She stated that in her 30 years on the federal bench, she had rarely seen a conspiracy so deeply rooted in pure, callous greed. She turned her attention to Valerie first. She outlined Valerie's extensive history of serial fraud, her multiple fake aliases, and her total lack of any genuine remorse. The judge struck her wooden gavel sharply and sentenced Valerie to 8 full years in a maximum security federal prison, completely without the possibility of early parole. Valerie finally broke. The arrogant mask shattered. She screamed at her defense attorney, her face twisting into an ugly, desperate panic as the massive weight of 8 locked years finally crashed down upon her. Then the judge turned her fierce attention to my son. She acknowledged that Kendrick had fully cooperated with the federal task force. She admitted that his direct testimony had been absolutely crucial in dismantling Valerie's massive international money laundering operation. However, the judge made it perfectly clear that his cooperation did not erase his undeniable guilt. He had committed severe wire fraud, attempted bank fraud, and malicious breaking and entering. He had betrayed his own mother and attempted to destroy a historic community sanctuary. He was a fully grown man who made his own terrible, greedy choices. The judge raised her gavel one final time. She sentenced Kendrick to exactly 4 years in a federal penitentiary. The wooden gavel echoed like a gunshot. 2 armed federal bailiffs stepped forward. They grabbed Valerie by the arms and dragged her out through the side doors while she kicked and screamed in hysterics. Another bailiff stepped behind Kendrick. He placed a heavy hand on my son's shoulder, commanding him to stand up. Kendrick slowly rose to his feet. The heavy steel chains around his waist and wrists rattled loudly. As the bailiff began to lead him away toward the holding cells, Kendrick stopped. He turned around and looked back at the gallery. He looked directly into my eyes one last time. His face was streaked with hot tears. He was silently begging for a single ounce of comfort, a small nod of forgiveness, or a tiny sliver of maternal warmth to carry into his cold concrete cell. I did not look away once. I held his desperate gaze with absolute unyielding strength, but I did not offer him a single smile. I simply watched the son I had raised face the ultimate devastating consequence of his own treacherous actions. The bailiff pulled hard on the heavy steel chain. Kendrick disappeared behind the heavy mahogany door. The heavy lock clicked shut with a loud final snap. The long storm was now completely over. The sentence did not feel like a victory parade. When the courtroom emptied, I remained seated for several minutes with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the low murmur of attorneys and the distant clank of courthouse doors. Sterling stood nearby without trying to offer easy comfort. Trey sat beside me, silent, old enough to understand that justice and grief can occupy the same room. I had wanted Kendrick stopped. I had never wanted to watch the boy I once carried disappear behind federal doors. Yet I also knew that rescuing him again would have taught him the same lesson that had ruined him in the first place, that his mother would always absorb the cost of his choices. This time, the cost belonged to him. 6 months passed rapidly. The bitter, freezing winter that had threatened to destroy our family finally surrendered to a bright, beautiful Georgia spring. The rolling pastures of Freedom Hill Ranch transformed into a vibrant, breathtaking ocean of deep green. I stood on my wrap-around porch early one Tuesday morning, holding a warm mug of black coffee, watching the champion quarter horses graze peacefully near the eastern tree line. The air smelled of damp earth, blooming honeysuckle, and sweet feed. The cold, sterile walls of the federal courthouse in Atlanta felt like a distant nightmare. The heavy mahogany doors and the loud snap of steel handcuffs had been entirely replaced by the gentle rustling of oak leaves and the rhythmic, comforting thud of horse hooves against the soft dirt. The long, devastating storm had finally broken, and the soil it left behind was incredibly fertile. We did not just survive the violent attempt to steal our generational wealth. We actively thrived in the aftermath. The brutal betrayal had forced us to completely reevaluate how we managed the ranch, and it highlighted exactly who was truly capable of carrying the heavy mantle of our family name. That person was undoubtedly my 19-year-old grandson. Trey had witnessed the absolute worst of human greed, and he responded by planting his feet firmly into the ground his grandfather had bled for. Shortly after his father was sentenced to federal prison, Trey made a massive, life-altering decision. He sat down at my kitchen table, looked me directly in the eye, and told me he was officially changing his major at Morehouse College. He shifted his primary focus to business administration, choosing to keep his cybersecurity and information technology studies as a minor. He told me he wanted to understand every single financial nuance of running a massive commercial agricultural operation. He wanted to know how to read corporate tax codes, negotiate liability insurance, and manage complex estate trusts. He refused to ever let another predatory land developer or greedy grifter find a single legal loophole in our armor. I listened to his passionate, determined speech with tears welling in my eyes. The very next morning, I called Mr. Sterling. We drafted brand new ironclad legal documents. We completely severed Kendrick from the family trust and formally transferred his entire 50% equity stake directly to Trey. When I handed my grandson the heavy notarized deed bearing his legal name, his hands shook. He did not look at the document like it was a giant casino chip or a quick ticket to a luxury lifestyle. He held that piece of paper like it was a sacred ancient artifact. He understood the profound weight of the blood and sacrifice that had paid for the ink on that page. He was officially a full partner in Freedom Hill Ranch. Trey immediately went to work, proving that my immense faith in him was entirely justified. He brought a brilliant modern energy to the historic property. He completely streamlined our administrative operations. Before Trey took over, I had managed the youth writing programs using old handwritten paper ledgers and endless phone calls. Trey built a beautiful, highly secure online booking platform from scratch. The new digital system allowed local community centers and inner-city schools to seamlessly schedule their field trips to the ranch. It managed the liability waivers, digitally organized the transportation logistics, and tracked our operational expenses with absolute pinpoint accuracy. He brought Freedom Hill firmly into the 21st century without losing a single ounce of its rustic historical soul. The money Kendrick had tried to steal months earlier had only been our own operating reserve, including the amount I had set aside to begin expanding services for veterans. We protected that reserve, but Trey wanted the program to become larger than anything I could have funded alone. He built a formal budget, documented the results of our existing youth programs, gathered the ranch's safety records, and helped me turn years of informal community work into a professional proposal. That distinction mattered to me. The new funding was not replacing money Kendrick had nearly stolen. It was outside support Trey earned after the crisis by proving that Freedom Hill could use every dollar responsibly. For the first time in months, paperwork entering my kitchen did not feel like a weapon. It felt like a door opening. But his greatest achievement was far more profound than just upgrading our computer systems. Trey remembered the intense passion I had for helping injured military veterans find peace through equine therapy. He took the initiative to aggressively pursue federal and state funding. He spent countless late nights at the kitchen table typing up massive, complex grant proposals. His hard work paid off in a spectacular fashion. 3 months ago, the state of Georgia awarded Freedom Hill Ranch a massive multi-year financial grant. The new funding allowed us to officially launch the Jeremiah Washington Veterans Healing Initiative. We hired 2 specialized equine therapists. We built brand new fully accessible wheelchair ramps leading directly up to the mounting blocks. We purchased 3 incredibly gentle older draft horses specifically trained to carry riders suffering from severe physical trauma and post-traumatic stress. We opened our massive iron gates to men and women who had sacrificed their minds and bodies for this country. We gave them a quiet, beautiful sanctuary where they could breathe clean air, brush the horses, and slowly learn how to find their inner peace again. The ranch was not just surviving, it was actively healing the broken hearts of our community. On a warm, sunny Saturday afternoon, Trey and I stood side by side leaning against the sturdy white wooden fences of the primary training arena. The sky above us was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The ranch was absolutely alive, humming with a beautiful, chaotic, joyful purpose. In the center of the dusty arena, a large group of young black children from a highly underfunded inner-city Atlanta neighborhood were petting a horse for the very first time in their entire lives. I watched a tiny, nervous 8-year-old girl reach her small, trembling hand out to touch the soft velvet nose of our gentlest mare. The massive animal lowered her head patiently, letting the little girl stroke her brown coat. The child let out a sudden, brilliant laugh of pure, unfiltered joy. Her smile lit up the entire arena. The heavy weight of the city, the concrete, and the daily struggles she faced at home simply vanished in the quiet, peaceful presence of the magnificent animal. This was exactly what Jeremiah had envisioned when he bought this land. He wanted to build a place where vulnerable children could feel entirely safe, powerful, and unconditionally loved. He wanted to show them that there was a vast, beautiful world existing far beyond the cramped, noisy city streets. He wanted them to know that this rich, valuable soil belonged to them too. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet Georgia air. The financial predators were locked away in cold concrete cells. The greedy socialite who hated the smell of this dirt was sitting in a federal penitentiary. The corporate developers had moved on to steal from easier targets. The legacy was completely safe. The protective walls we had reinforced had held firm against the violent storm. We had successfully defended the massive empire. Trey rested his strong forearms on the top rail of the white fence. He was wearing a faded navy blue baseball cap that used to belong to his grandfather. It was dusty and worn, but he wore it like a genuine crown. He watched the young children laughing and running safely in the dirt. He smiled a wide, genuine expression of deep contentment. He looked completely at peace with the entire world and his rightful place in it. "You know, Big Mama," Trey said quietly, his deep voice carrying over the happy sounds of the active ranch. He did not take his bright eyes off the small children playing in the sandy arena. "Grandpa Jeremiah would be really incredibly proud of what we are doing out here today. He would absolutely love seeing these wonderful kids smiling right here on his personal land." I turned my head and looked at the strong, intelligent, deeply honorable young man standing right beside me. I looked at the sturdy hands that had typed the complex digital codes to save us from absolute financial ruin. I looked at the hands that now carried the heavy, sacred torch of our proud family name into the bright, beautiful future of the very next generation. "He would definitely be so incredibly proud of the ranch, Trey," I said, reaching out and gently patting his strong, broad shoulder with immense affection. "But he would be infinitely more proud of you. You protected our entire family when it counted the absolute most. You secured the legacy forever. I am so incredibly proud of the strong, brilliant man you have truly become." I stood there at the white wooden fence line for a very long time after Trey walked back toward the main house to check on the evening feed. The Georgia sun was beginning its slow descent over the western ridge of Freedom Hill Ranch. The sky gradually transformed into a breathtaking canvas of burnt orange, deep violet, and shimmering gold. The warm evening light bathed all 500 acres of our secure, untouchable land in a perfectly peaceful glow. The champion quarter horses lowered their heavy heads to graze in the tall grass, their long shadows stretching across the very same dirt that my husband had worked so tirelessly to claim as our own. I looked out over the beautiful empire we had built, and I thought deeply about the heavy, often painful reality of generational wealth. In our community, we talk so much about leaving a legacy behind for our children. We hustle, we grind, and we break our backs, trying to accumulate premium property, thick bank accounts, and thriving commercial businesses. We desperately want to shield our descendants from the brutal financial struggles that we had to endure. But I learned a very hard, devastating lesson this year. Financial wealth is completely useless if you do not also pass down the absolute wealth of strong character. Generational wealth is not just the liquid money sitting in a trust fund or the massive acreage listed on a property deed. True generational wealth is the unshakable resilience, the deep moral integrity, and the profound respect for your history that you actively instill in the next generation. I gave my son Kendrick every single financial privilege that Jeremiah and I never had growing up. We gave him a prestigious debt-free college education. We gave him a pristine family name. We gave him a life completely insulated from harsh physical labor. But in shielding him from the storm, we accidentally raised a man who did not know how to build a reliable shelter. You simply cannot hand a massive, hard-won empire to a foolish man and expect that empire to survive the winter. It will crumble the very moment a shiny distraction catches his eye. Kendrick treated his sacred birthright like a disposable casino chip. He was entirely willing to pave over the blood and sweat of his own ancestors just to buy the temporary affection of a professional grifter. As a mother, watching the federal police place heavy steel handcuffs on my only son was the single most agonizing moment of my entire life. It broke my heart into 1,000 irreparable pieces. But I realized that sometimes protecting your family means actively protecting them from their own destructive greed. Sometimes the most profound act of maternal love is stepping aside and allowing them to face the absolute maximum consequence of their terrible choices. I had to let my son fall so our grand legacy could remain standing. I turned my gaze away from the setting sun and looked directly at you, the person listening to my story today. I know there are wealthy people in my old Atlanta social circles who call me a cold, ruthless woman for letting my own flesh and blood go to a federal prison. They whisper behind my back that a real mother would have bailed him out and quietly covered up his massive crimes. But I want you to tell me the absolute truth. If someone aggressively tried to sell your family's sacred history just to buy the shallow affection of a greedy gold digger, would you have done anything different?